So we talked about this, I think, on a previous podcast, but we're revisiting this because of the case that was just filed last week.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2022, the Supreme Court said, well, okay, you have to have at least 2 election judges that are party balanced. The rest of them can be deputies, all right, but you got to have 2 that are party balanced. So that would mean that at least one, okay, Republican or nominally Republican election judge is going to be in the room where they're counting these ballots,
Mm-hmm.
at least one. Well, fast forward to last week. So my colleague sought some information from the county to say, hey, mind if I take a look at your ballot board composition?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it turns out, and they provided the information kicking and screaming, threatened another lawsuit or whatever else, provided the information. And it turns out that Hennepin County is now saying,
Which is Minneapolis.
which is Minneapolis, okay, is now saying we don't have to have any election judges on our ballot board at all. 0. None.
Really?
Really.
Welcome back to On the Line. In today's episode, we sit down again with Mr. Greg Joseph, which, if you haven't seen him in our past interviews, he's a lawyer who's found a specialty in defending liberty, but also dealing with government malfeasance. In this episode, he's going to talk about some of the things that are going on in elections today, because, of course, this is coming up in just a week, and also give us some insights onto things going on with Ukraine and around the world. He's a great guest just to have on to kind of keep us updated on what's going on with the world, because his job is to see what's going on behind the scenes. We hope you enjoy this episode. And as always, if you can like or share this video, it helps get this message out to more and more people. Thanks, and God bless. Okay, well, we just finished up a riveting story about your trip to the Boundary Waters this last week that was ended with a doe.
A non-trip to the Boundary Waters. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. And the doe lived.
No way.
She did. Yeah. At least we couldn't find her corpse.
Yeah.
But what she did leave for us was on the passenger side, door, window, and roof rack was the contents of her colon that she spread over the side of the vehicle. Just, she wanted to make sure that we knew how she felt about us and
Yep.
about the car.
Yep.
And so she spread that over the side of the car.
Just to what is it?
To
Salt
twist-
to insult. Just
Twist the knife a
Yeah.
little bit. Yeah. So
Oh, man.
anyway, yeah. But she's probably got a few broken ribs for what it's worth.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Well, bummer the trip didn't work out. But,
Yeah. That's the way it goes.
yeah. But
We will
you would endorse for everyone Boundary Waters?
Oh, no question.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's a great place to take a family. It's a great place to take kids.
Mhm.
And, be smart, but basic precautions, you're going to be fine.
Mhm.
I mean, there are enough places where if something goes really wrong, the Forest Service is there and they'll find you. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, beautiful. Have you been?
No. My dad used to go every couple years. He'd go. He was from Michigan, but him and a buddy
Oh, yeah.
would come up to Boundary Waters, and we almost went a couple times, but it just didn't work out. I think I might have been in grad school at the time, so we just never nailed it down.
Right.
And now we're here, a couple hours away, so I've got to get something on the books.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's great. Yeah. You'd love it. It's beautiful. I mean, if you're lucky, you catch fish, but the way that works is if you plan on catching fish for your meals, you won't catch any fish.
Mhm.
But if you pack enough food,
You'll catch a lot of fish.
then you'll catch tons of fish. Yeah. It won't be a problem.
Yeah.
So you got to pack food, even if it's bad food,
Mhm.
you got to have it, and then you'll catch fish. So generally.
Ben, have you been? Yeah. Years ago. Okay.
I just bring stuff on my own. Yeah. Yeah. I got a canoe that holds like 850 pounds. Yeah. So we load her down and yeah, it's good. So this would have been Jess and I plus the 2 boys plus the gear. We were figuring out it was going to be somewhere close to 650 or 700. I mean, the tent is heavy, but whatever. Would have made
So
it.
how's that wall tent work? I've never seen one of those. So
It's like an outfitter tent.
Mhm.
So it's just canvas. It's 5 by 8.
Mhm.
And it's got a little corner that's dedicated like as a stove jack. So it has like a fiberglass kind of ring, and then you put the chimney through that,
Mhm.
and then you process wood. You bring a little folding saw and a little hatchet or axe or whatever you need, and you cut dead down wood. You can be careful that you do that because regulations are what they are.
Mm-hmm.
But there's enough dead down trees up there that, wood's not a problem. You can't pick wood next to the campsite, because believe it or not, people have thought of that before. So you got to go somewhere where, people don't look for wood. But then, you just, the tent is canvas. It's just like duck cloth, like heavy cotton.
Mm-hmm.
And so it breathes. So when you start a fire in there, any moisture that's on top of the tent will kind of evaporate. And it works the same way a wood stove does. So if you have wet gear, if you go to an ice house, if you go ice fishing, most of them use like a propane stove.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with that is, propane's byproduct is water. So it's warm, but it's also like kind of wet, a little muggy. But the wood stove dries out everything. So if you got dry mittens, dry boots, wet mittens, wet boots, wet socks, wet gear, whatever, hang it up and it dries right out. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah. That's the same argument people make for wood burning for saunas. Right. Is it just, they always say it produces a different type of heat, which I have not done a wood burning sauna. I've done a lot of,
I don't think I have either.
Yeah. So the claim is that it's a better dry heat, which of course is your goal in a sauna.
Right.
So.
Right. I mean, that makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, it's pretty slick. You'd think it would get wet if it rains or snows or whatever, but it really doesn't. It really dries out pretty quickly. So, it's heavy. It's kind of a pain to haul in, especially in the winter. You pull a sled behind you, and they call it a pulk, and you snowshoe that in and set it up, and but yeah, it's good. You're kind of limited by how far you can snowshoe, really.
Mm-hmm.
And so it'll be a few years before I'll take the boys. Obviously, they're 6 and 7 or whatever. So like that's part of the deal. So I took them in last year for the first time,
mm-hmm.
and part of the problem there was, they can't paddle the boat.
Mm-hmm.
They can't pack their own gear. They can't make a fire. They can't process wood. They can't cook dinner. They will probably fall in the lake. I would expect that like the fishing gear that they're using will either end up in their arm or tangled hopelessly, and then they lose interest and start wrestling with each other.
Yeah.
So, which is great. I mean, because, whatever, but it's also a lot of work to do solo.
Yeah, I bet.
So you got to have a swivel, on your head all the time to make sure they're safe.
Not a lot of relaxation.
No. But Jessica would have been good for that this time around.
Yeah.
But, that's okay. We'll do it again.
Well,
So,
nice.
Yeah.
Well, we are live, right, Bennett? Yeah. Okay. So we are back with Mr. Greg, and you've been on a couple times. Greg Joseph, sorry, but you've been on a couple times, and kind of your angle when we have you on is you're a lawyer, and you've kind of found a niche in the market, right, where you've been doing a lot of things, kind of dealing with shenanigans, especially that government does to impede on the liberties of people. And some of them, what you've talked about in the past, are just gross negligence, right, at best.
Right.
And sometimes even worse than that, right? It's a little bit more diabolical at times. And you've been of value in the past of just being able to show us what kind of things are going on that we should be aware of. So we've kind of called in the past, like what's going on in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I know you've got some different things prepared for us. We're going to air this next week, so this is as up to date as any of our episodes can be.
Right.
Right. So what's going on right now? What are some things that we should have our eyes on?
Great. Well, one of the things I've been getting a lot of questions recently about my thoughts on the judges. I mean, believe it or not, if you flip your ballot over, there's other people on the back that are running for office. I mean, even though a lot of people kind of vote the front, you vote the big ticket people, and then you just don't turn the ballot over. But in Minnesota, we still have judicial elections. And so it's rare that a judge is opposed by someone. And that makes sense if you think about it, because that attorney is going to have to argue in front of that judge in the future, in other cases. And so if they run against the judge and lose, now I'm not questioning the impartiality of the judiciary, of course. That said, okay, hi, Judge. Remember that thing I said on the campaign trail? No offense or anything. Anyway, my client here is really a good guy, and I think you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But there are a few or a couple of things that voters should be aware of.
Is that in every state, by the way?
No, not in every
Okay,
state.
so just in Minnesota and maybe some others.
And some others.
Yeah.
And some others. And it's kind of polarizing. People have strong feelings about it one way or the other, because on the one hand, you don't think of the judiciary as a political position, even though they're appointed by partisan politicians. You'd like to believe that judges are sort of above the fray, that you don't think about that kind of stuff. And in an ideal world, they would be, but that's just not reality,
Mm-hmm.
and you're seeing, plus, I mean, more than that though, you're seeing the U.S. Supreme Court being politicized more than it ever has.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you saw the arrests a couple of years ago, during when the Dobbs decision came out. You heard about the person who was arrested outside, was it Kavanaugh's house, who had a bomb or something, or who said his intention was to assassinate, one of the justices or something. Crazy stuff.
Do they have good security? Because I think about that all the time. Like
I hope so.
Those guys have targets on their back. They have to.
Right. And in this environment, it's just so polarizing,
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's just a reality. So, but yeah, anyway, elections are what they are. And, I always think it's better to give voters more choices than fewer choices,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that's worth. So if a judge is running with somebody opposed, I don't have any problem with that. So, yeah.
So we've got some here in Minnesota. Is there anyone that we should have our eyes on, and if so, why?
Well, so, yeah, I think so. There's a judge who is up for his seat on the Minnesota Supreme Court, named Carl Procaccini. And Carl Procaccini was Tim Walz's general counsel. Okay, he was more than anyone responsible for the drafting of the executive orders, the raft of executive orders that we saw in the wake of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've got a lot to say about it, about kind of why it's so important that people pay attention to this, because we've got a real problem in Minnesota right now. And I'm going to come back to that particular race in a minute. Okay. But in Minnesota, we have Chapter 12 of Minnesota statutes is kind of set out to deal with what happens in the case of an emergency. Under what circumstances can the governor declare a peacetime emergency? Okay. So there was litigation over this a couple of years ago, and then it wound up being remanded to the Court of Appeals, and then it came back up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court made a decision on this in May, okay? But nothing's really changed since then. And I can't remember the last time we recorded together, and the opinion may have just come down when we talked the last time. But I really want to drill down on something, because people need to be aware that nothing in Chapter 12 has changed. So the question that was asked in that lawsuit was, can a governor declare a peacetime emergency in the name of a pandemic? Okay. And in that case, it was COVID, but
Mm-hmm.
it could be anything else. This next time, we don't know what the limits are. Okay. So the Supreme Court opined in May, and the arguments against what the governor did were basically, it's a violation of the delegation of powers principle. So the Constitution says legislature makes laws, the executive enforces the laws or carry them out, and the judiciary interprets what those laws mean. Well, what this does, what Chapter 12 does, is basically delegates to the governor, Governor Walz in this case, the authority to make his own laws. Okay, so the argument was it's a violation of the delegation of powers principle. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That argument didn't go anywhere. Then the other argument was there should be some sort of a qualitative analysis. So in other words, are we going to give the executive the authority to declare a peacetime emergency in the name of the common cold?
Mm-hmm.
Is, an outbreak of, what? Name it. An outbreak of chickenpox, right? Yeah. Is that enough to force masks on people's faces and lock them down and impose travel restrictions and declare some people essential and some other people not essential? The Supreme Court interpreted the law as it is now, which is no. There is no qualitative analysis that's necessary. And if the governor declares an emergency, he declares an emergency. So the end result of that was 16 months of a solo dictatorship. We had no legislature for 16 months. And the only reason Governor Walz relented and he released that power is because it became clear he wouldn't have the votes to keep it going. So the way Chapter 12 is written, it says you can declare an emergency, but you only get that emergency power for 5 days. 5 days, okay? Unless the executive council, I think it's called, which is comprised of like loyalists, okay? Somebody, I think the AG, I think the Secretary of State's on it, I think the Lieutenant Governor, and then maybe 1 or 2 other people. So if they say it's okay, then you can have the emergency power up to 30 days. But then after that, if the legislature votes to take it away, okay, it's reviewed every 30 days. If they vote to take it away, it disappears. If they don't vote to take it away,
then it stays.
The peacetime emergency continues, right?
So how did it get to 16 months?
Well, because all 3 houses were under control of the same political party. So nobody wanted to take it away because it worked for everybody, except, of course, for all the rest of us who didn't vote for someone in one of the 3 major parties. So, and then again, at the end of that time, it, became clear that the votes weren't there. And so he had to relent, and that's when it went away. But again, the problem is that nothing's changed with it. There's a very simple fix. Okay. So in the second time this case went to the Supreme Court, the one that came down in May, the court said, well, this is what the law says. It's not our job to legislate from the bench. We interpret the laws, we don't draft them, and this is what it says, for better or for worse. Well, Justice Anderson, who just retired earlier this year, and I wish him a very long and very peaceful and very happy retirement. Justice Anderson was fantastic. He wrote a concurring opinion that said, hey, this needs to be fixed, and not later when there's an emergency. It needs to be fixed now. Okay. And his solution was very simple, and he's absolutely right, which is all we have to do is flip it and say that every 30 days, the legislature has to reauthorize the emergency powers declaration. And as long as the governor gets the okay from the legislature, then it continues. But to flip it from the negative over to the positive. And that way, at least you can hold people accountable for their decisions. If you don't like the way your legislator voted, you say your senator should have said, hey, or your congressman should have said, hey, there's no reason to have these powers right now. The legislature's all together. I mean, these laws were written for alien invasions and floods and earthquakes and total catastrophes, right? And one of the requirements is that the municipalities aren't equipped to handle them on their own, and we can go back and forth whether that was the case with COVID or not. I mean, municipalities and counties were charged with a lot of responsibilities anyway, for example, enforcing the mask mandates and everything else, which would tell me that on some level, local governments are able to solve these problems. But that part aside, okay, they weren't written for someone to seize power for 16 months. So all you'd have to do is flip that from the negative, voting to take it away, to voting to reauthorize. Which holds them accountable. And then everything changes. So, but again, the person who drafted those policies, those executive orders that were, not like anything we've ever seen in this state or in this country. Okay. That person is on the Supreme Court right now.
So do you think that we may run into a situation in the future? I've heard different people with this take, right? That especially with the election coming up, there's chances that there's going to be a lot of disrest, or what's the right word? Not disrest.
Discord, unrest.
Yeah, unrest, discord. With that there might be another situation where there's going to be kind of grabs at power. Do you see some of that coming?
Well, all the ingredients are there. And it might not be for civil unrest, although I think absolutely the cities are primed for chaos. I mean, they were in 2022. I mean, these were also written to deal with the riots after the Floyd mess, So yeah, if it's not done in the name of civil unrest, maybe they do it in the name of climate change. I mean, I believe, and I have to check this, but I believe Hennepin County and Ramsey County, Minneapolis and St. Paul, have both declared climate emergencies. And so they're really, I mean, there's not much stopping a governor who was of that mind to say, we can't have you driving your cars. It's getting too hot outside. We can't have you with cows in the field. We all know what they do to contribute to global warming. So, you got to cull the herd. I mean, we have to have some meaningful conversation about the limit of these powers because it's rife for abuse right now. So, yeah, we got to fix it. Not just for us, but for our kids. Because this isn't going to change unless we change it.
Are you seeing some of that abuse of power in the election area? That's something I know we've talked about, and you're kind of you play a role in trying to protect kind of the election rights. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What do you see going on there?
Well, a couple of things. So we just touched on it very briefly, but I got a phone call today from my dear friend and colleague. He filed an emergency motion last week with the Minnesota Supreme Court. And what's going on is, and it's easy to get lost in the weeds on this stuff, and like I'm trying to avoid too much legal nerdery here, but anyway, so I argued a case back in 2022 at the Minnesota Supreme Court, and it was Minnesota Voters Alliance versus Ramsey County and Olmsted County. And so to recap a little bit, basically what the legislature did was they drafted this big set of laws that make sure that the people counting the ballots are party balanced. You want to have one representative from each major political party. Okay. And if you have a third, if you have we have two more in Minnesota, there's the legal marijuana party, and then there's some other marijuana party or something. I think one of those was disqualified. Disqualified.
Marijuana party has two different parties?
They have two parties. Yeah. And what's so funny about that was that they couldn't get their stuff together to figure out how to work together and just be unified. So there was all this like bickering and party and stuff.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. Anyway, so I think one of those might have actually been decertified as a major party prior to this election. Okay. But nevertheless, okay. Minnesota has two, and I think a third that qualify as major political parties under the statute. Okay. And there are certain requirements for that aren't particularly important. So
you want a representative from each of those parties.
Correct. And you have to have, so the election judges, okay, who are on the absentee ballot board. And again, you might think, well, absentee ballots, what about the people who are voting in person? Right. But beginning a few years ago with COVID, absentee ballots became the vast majority of ballots that are cast in Minnesota. So people who go to the polls are actually in the minority now.
Really? Okay.
And so the people counting the ballots, the legislature was very, very careful. It's over a huge body of law. They wanted to make sure that you have one from each party that are counting, so that we know the people who are counting our ballots are not biased one way or the other. Okay. Well, in 2022, we had Ramsey County and Olmsted County, which is Rochester. And both of those counties' positions was, we don't have to do that because there's this little sentence in here that says they have to be party balanced election judges unless they are deputy county auditors. And in that case, they don't have to be party balanced anymore. That's what the law says. Okay, that's what was drafted and passed by our legislature. So we talked about this, I think, on a previous podcast, but we're revisiting this because of the case that was just filed last week. So in 2022, the Supreme Court said, well, okay, you have to have at least two election judges that are party balanced. The rest of them can be deputies, all right, but you got to have two that are party balanced. So that would mean that at least one, okay, Republican or nominally Republican election judge is going to be in the room where they're counting these ballots, at least one. Well, fast forward to last week. So my colleague sought some information from the county to say, hey, mind if I take a look at your ballot board composition? Well, it turns out, and they provided the information kicking and screaming, threatened another lawsuit or whatever else, provided the information. And it turns out that Hennepin County is now saying,
which is Minneapolis,
okay, is now saying we don't have to have any election judges on our ballot board at all. 0. None.
Really?
So their estimate was something like 6,000 election judges are necessary for processing of all the ballots in Hennepin County.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, they had 1,500 names of election judges back in May. So what Hennepin County did was they took those 1,500 names and they said, oh, you know what? The cities are going to exhaust all of these names anyway, and there aren't going to be any left for us to begin with. So forget it. We're going to send this out to the cities, get this off our desk, and then we're going to appoint all exclusively handpicked deputy county auditors, which is not defined anywhere in any of the statutes.
Who picks?
Oh, well, that would be the Hennepin County Elections Office, and her name's Ginny Gelms. Okay, she's the director of elections in Hennepin County, and she's one of the named defendants in this case. Because again, the argument is no, the decision from 2022 says you have to have at least one from each major political party. There has to be balance. And
So what's their argument? Is their play just that hopefully this gets kicked down the road until after the election? Or do they say, oh no, we've got a real reasonable, what's their reason for doing that?
it's a great question. And it's so new that I don't know what they're coming up with yet. They haven't even briefed it yet.
Mhm.
So I think my colleague's brief was just due a couple of days ago, and I think theirs is coming up pretty quickly. But the takeaway, okay, is that this is not a Hennepin County thing. This is happening all across the state. And the people who are counting your ballots, people who are counting the absentee ballots, are not balanced by party at all.
Mhm.
They are hand chosen. They're often young activists, people who are, members of political action committees or certain groups, or union members, government union members who have a pretty clear record of voting in one particular direction.
Mhm.
Okay. Those are the people that are sitting in those rooms counting your absentee ballots.
Is this what happened in 2020, or is this
Mhm.
even different from 2020?
This is the same thing that happened in 2020.
Okay, so they
Yeah.
pulled a similar thing before.
Correct. And this isn't just a Minnesota thing.
Right.
I mean, this is happening elsewhere in the country too. What's funny about it is, you wouldn't call that voter fraud. It really isn't voter fraud. I don't know what name you call it, but you almost have to listen for what's not being said. You hear people protest, well, there's never been a voter fraud case in Minnesota that's been proven ever. There's no such thing as voter fraud. You hear it all the time.
Mhm.
Okay, well, what do we want to call that then? Because whatever that is, it's not consistent with, certainly not consistent with the spirit of the law. Okay, the spirit of the law is very clearly, you want balance, you want party balance. Totally inconsistent with that. And it could well be inconsistent with the letter of the law too.
Mhm.
And that's what we're figuring out.
Is it going to get figured out before the election?
Highly unlikely.
Mhm.
Highly unlikely. But it's possible. Okay, I mean, we have a couple weeks, and all you'd really have to do is say, hey, don't go here on this day, go over here instead. Because they're Hennepin County residents.
Mhm.
It's just the assumption, again, by the county is, well, you go do it in the city or whatever you want to do, but we're going to handle the county stuff over here.
Mhm.
So it could be fixed. But
Are there other examples you're seeing throughout the country? I get notifications on different things here or there, but have you seen some different things with voter integrity?
there is a really interesting case out of Pinellas County, Florida. And Pinellas County is pretty historically red, okay? But someone ran for commissioner of elections, I think, down there, and their opponent had been there for a couple of cycles. They were both nominally red team, right? But the opponent who lost in the primary got evidence that hundreds of thousands, I want to say 240 or 250,000 ballots were mailed out and returned as undeliverable. But the vast majority of those, 210 or 220,000 of those ballots, actually got cast anyway, and the votes were processed and counted. And so they would send them to places like Walmart parking lots or, uninhabited buildings or vacant land or whatever. And then they'd bounce back as undeliverable, but it's undeliverable. The name's still there. The ballot's still there.
So these would be people that never actually got their ballot, but then
Right.
their ballot gets cast and someone else did the casting.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And that's the suit. Okay.
Mhm.
So this guy, and I don't remember his name. It's in Pinellas County. But at any rate, he's filed this complaint already. He has exhibits. It's supported. It's in the public record. You can see what he has. And the comment was, this is being replicated across the country in different jurisdictions, that they're sending out absentee ballots en masse that are undeliverable. And then when they're returned, they're somehow collected and they're filled out and the votes are cast anyway.
Mm.
And suddenly you have hundreds of thousands of votes from people who aren't around or who don't live there anymore, who might have moved, who could be dead, and they're cast. And the problem is there's no effective way. There's no look back. So once the election is done, there isn't a judge in the country, who's going to step up and say, hey, let's undo the whole thing and let's relitigate all of this. So, and there's obviously no impetus by the people who were aware of it, and so once it's done, it's kind of done, and you've seen examples across the country, and this is often cited too, where, there's never been any evidence. There's never been any case that's been litigated, and there's never been proven that there's any voter fraud. Okay. The first thing is you have to separate the idea of a vote or a voter from a ballot, because what wins elections is the most ballots. Okay. The voter, the expression of the public will, that's secondary. We don't think about those things anymore. We think about ballots. All right. So, but what you hear all the time is there's never been any case that's been litigated that proves voter fraud. That's sort of half true, because there have been lots of cases across the country that have been dismissed for lack of standing. But that's not the same thing as a merits argument. So standing, okay, in any criminal case, you've got to have standing, which means you have to have a dog in the fight. Okay. So if Brian Stecker is irritated because the guy who was supposed to fix his roof, wasted his money, didn't show up, or did a poor job or whatever, I can't sue the guy who did your roof because it's not my roof, and I didn't contract with the guy. So if we went to court and I sued your roofer, it would be dismissed for lack of standing. Okay. So that's a simple example of it. It's a little bit more complex in these cases, obviously, but judges across the country have shown a propensity for dismissing cases for lack of standing. So, which not incidentally is why our case with Dr. Jensen was dismissed earlier this year. It was for lack of standing. So do we have evidence? There's certainly smoke. There's lots of smoke. But let me give you another example. So under the Constitution, it's the responsibility of the state legislatures to draft election laws. Well, what happened prior to 2020 is you had this strategy, they called it sue and settle, where there would be a group that would bring a lawsuit. Okay, it would be a group, Minnesotans for Positive Change or something like that, and they would sue the Secretary of State and say, hey, this election law is not right, and we think it should be closer to this because fill in the blank. Okay. And the Secretary of State, okay, who was actually politically aligned with this group, would say, hey, wait a minute. No, and he's like, that's outrageous and that's terrible. We won't settle for anything like that. But I'll tell you what, maybe if we drafted this compromise between what our rule is and what you'd like to see happen with the election, maybe we'll take that in front of the judge and maybe we can get the judge to sign off on this proposed settlement in this case. And so they would draft what the policy is today, and they would take it to a judge, and the judge would sign off on the settlement. And suddenly you have a new way to administer elections in your state that's completely unconstitutional. Okay, but there it is. It's not the legislature making the laws. It's the administrative state making the laws. So that's happening. That's happened with regularity before 2020, and I'm certain it's happening again. I couldn't point you to an exact example, but I'm certain it's still happening.
So are there groups of people that have been working to try to uncover some of these these ways of kind of cheating and backdoors and such, are there groups across the country that are working on this?
Yeah.
Right? Because you do. I mean, you just gave an example. I'll get updates and stuff on my phone of different examples. I think there was a county in Michigan or something like that had 500,000 more people on the ballot than lived, and this was just something like a couple weeks ago, right? So there's a lot of these examples.
Mm-hmm.
But are there groups that are working to fight against this? So, like, do we have hope of election integrity here in 3 weeks?
Absolutely. We do. So Michigan, by the way, I just saw a headline in Michigan. I think they have 8.4 million registered voters, and they have 8.0 million residents. So that's pretty tough to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think it said 78 of the 84 counties have more registered voters than they do people who live there.
And usually it should be less, because usually not everybody registers.
By definition.
Yeah.
Yeah, it has to be less.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't have, how many registered voters do you have? Or how many actual voters do you have? Yeah. That should be the same or fewer when it comes to registered. So anyway, that's happening. Do we have cause for optimism? Yeah, absolutely. There are groups that are doing awesome things. I mentioned the Minnesota Voters Alliance here. And they're the nominal plaintiff in the case I just mentioned from last week in Hennepin County. They're doing great work. But there are voter integrity efforts in every state. In Arizona, they've done great things. I know Florida. I know Georgia has a group. Georgia has a group that's been looking at the voting machines. And
do you know what's going on there?
I know that this was originally a technology that was developed by a company called Smartmatic.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to say too much about it, but I know that company sold, and the technology is still in use, and it's been used around the world in other areas in elections that were questionable.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't say exactly where they are with things now or how much of that technology has been adapted. So I can't say for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there are people who are doing great things, but ultimately these are problems that are going to have to be fixed at the legislative level, because the courts can only do so much. And the groups like Minnesota Voters Alliance, which is great. I've represented them, in a couple of cases. The judiciary is not legislating.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be your elected officials. So the best way to make a change truly is to vote for the right people and get them in there. There's just been so much apathy. People have been, they've had other stuff on their minds in the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but if we want to see real change, that's how we got to do it.
How do you think this is going to play out? Like, do you think that post-election we're going to have a lot of these legal type battles this time around? And we did last time, but I think what happened last time was everyone was completely caught off guard, right? So when the narrative started arising that, hey, maybe some of this stuff was not done correctly, right? And you had video, and you had, the whole thing that took place after the election.
Right.
One of the things that was distinct there was nobody expected that. So this was the first time anyone had heard some of these arguments or these narratives. Maybe you've heard those things before, but for normal citizens like myself, like that was not something we ever thought about in previous elections.
Right.
This time around, we all heard about those things 4 years ago. Whether you bought it or you dismissed it, either way, you've heard about it before. So it doesn't have that element of surprise. So do you think that this is going to be a time where like the election's going to happen, and then, on Wednesday, everyone's going to go, oh, there we go, I guess that's who won? Or is there going to be a lot of this fighting that's going to take place? And if it does take place, what's it going to look like? Is it going to look different than last time?
Right. Yes, I do think there are going to be fights. I think it's going to be a mess, unfortunately. And I think we're going to be looking at the same thing where we don't know who the winner is for days on end. We're going to see counts and recounts and recounts and recounts. And we're already being told, you see reports now, hey, don't expect to know on Tuesday. Who do you think you are? No, this is a lot of work to do. And these people are just, burning the candle at both ends, counting as fast as they can. Unless there's a plumbing leak in the other room, and then they're going to stop for 2 hours, just to make sure, But yeah, right. So they're already sort of priming the pump. This is what you should expect. It's going to take a long time to count all these. So yeah, I think we're going to be in for that. There's a guy from Maryland named Jamie Raskin who, let's see, this would have been 6 weeks ago or so, made a statement. At least it was in the press 6 weeks ago. Might have been earlier than that. But anyway, he made a statement at some sort of a book reading or something like that, where he said, "Hey, if Trump wins, then he's going to put Congress in the position next January 5th or 6th or 7th or whatever it is, the day he's supposed to take office. And the legislature is going to have to declare that he's ineligible. We're going to have to nullify the election results because he's an insurrectionist."
Mm.
And that comes straight from the, I'm going to get the amendment wrong.
Is it 24?
Is it 24 or 25? Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head. But anyway, the insurrection, the word insurrection, and do you know where that comes from?
Mm-mm.
So after the Civil War, there were all these generals from the South who had designs on becoming the president of the United States. And that way they would reverse everything that, the Union won in the war between the states. Well, for unity of government purposes, the Union and, the legislature had to say, well, sorry, guys, but you lost, and we can't have you coming in here. You were participants in an insurrection against this country. You and the Confederacy were trying to, overthrow the duly elected representatives of the United States government. So you can't assume office. You can't hold office anymore because you forfeited that right when you took up arms against the government.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where all these laws came from. And so that word insurrection, that was chosen very specifically back on January 6th.
Uh-huh.
Exactly right.
So that's what that's about. Okay.
That's where that's about. And so all the people who really, if today, I think most people can look at January 6th and say, okay, we do have a Second Amendment in this country, and not one of them was armed. Nobody had a gun. No one. And we're supposed to believe that that was actually about overthrowing the government? Really? That was about an insurrection, right? Anyway.
So that's why that's why they pushed so hard for that narrative and using that term, because if they can do that and then they can link it to Trump, then basically they can use that as a means by saying he can't be president.
Precisely.
Okay.
And if they can tie him in to the insurrection effort, then he falls within the statutory definition, and sorry, he can't do it. Now, he could have been prosecuted for an actual insurrection. Never was. Okay. But that hasn't stopped anybody in the past. We just call him that, We say it's an insurrection, and therefore he becomes ineligible. So anyway, Jamie Raskin made some comments to the effect of, well, you're going to put the legislature in a position to declare him ineligible, nullify the election results, and out he goes. Now, is that going to happen? I have no idea. I don't know what's going to look like. But people should know that word was chosen purposely, with a very specific intent. And that's to line it up for exactly what we're looking at right now.
So it's probably going to be ugly afterwards. Either way.
I'm afraid so. Yeah, I don't know what other end result there's going to be. And we've talked about this before, that it's hard to imagine a scenario where the left accepts the election of Donald Trump, or the right accepts the loss of Donald Trump.
What kind of things would you look for, like, let's say during the election day, or like over that kind of, 5 p.m. up until kind of that next morning, that would raise red flags for you, right? Because I think the one for me was I went to bed really late that night, and I remember seeing, like, going to bed and talking with family and stuff, and it certainly looked like the election was Donald Trump. And then I woke up a couple hours later, and all of a sudden everything had shifted so quickly. That was kind of a red flag, not at the moment, but looking back, right? But are there things to kind of look for? Because normally, it's 9:30 at night and they're calling Florida, right? Or they're calling Pennsylvania. That's how elections have been in the past.
Right.
What kind of things are we going to look for to say, okay, it seems like something goofy's going on?
Right. So the first thing I thought of when you said that was, you ever seen the chart? So there's a chart that shows the counting of ballots. Okay. So this line this was the red line. And then there was a parallel line down here. And this was sort of the blue line down here. And then all of a sudden, right about here, it went whoop, and then it jumped up over the top of the red, and then it continued that way all the way to the end of the night. And so when people looked at that and said, well, that little spike right there, what was that? Well, the answer we were given was, well, that's because all of the precincts around the inner cities came in at the same time, and they counted all those ballots at the same time. And that's why, because they all jumped straight up, and they were all, leaning in one direction. And so we counted those at once, and that's how it came out. It's patently absurd. Okay.
Mhm.
It's just not the case. So I would say, that, but there's no excuse to stop counting ballots. And it happened in 5 states. They stopped for
Which
an
5?
hour, 2
Remember?
hours. Yep. It was Atlanta. So it was Georgia. It was
Was it Milwaukee?
Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Yep. Milwaukee. Philadelphia was
Mhm.
another one. I believe it was Arizona was another one, and then was it North
Detroit?
Carolina? Maybe it was Michigan. Maybe
Okay.
that's right. Okay. So it may have been more. Okay, but those were the famous examples where they stopped counting for 2 hours, hour and a half, 2 hours, and then they resumed again.
Mhm.
And there's absolutely no excuse. There's no reason for that to happen at all.
Mhm.
None. I mean, but backing up, I mean, really, you're seeing things like what happened in California. Okay, Gavin Newsom just declared that any county or any local government who requires voter ID is in violation of state law. You cannot require voter ID in California anymore. And the only reason to eliminate a voter ID requirement is to facilitate fraud.
Mhm.
There is absolutely no other reason for it. In Minnesota, anybody can go down to a government office and get a government ID. Anybody can do it. You don't have to get a driver's license. Forget it. Just get a government issued ID. It's some nominal fee, I don't know, $20 or something, or $15, something like that. So there's no excuse for that. And so, yeah, I mean, what to look for on election night? Any stoppage in counting. Anytime you hear, well, they're telling us now that's going to be an additional 3 days before they're finished with that stack, and then there's a truck that's coming in with a couple of pallets with some more ballots on it, and that's going to take a while too. And so I think it's one of those things where you'll know it if you see it.
Yeah. So why do you think Trump looks so calm? Because he does look so calm.
Yeah.
More than last time. Like last time, he was. He's always kind of a jokester, but like he certainly looked like he was on edge sometimes. To where this time he just looks so calm. To where all the things you're talking about, the voter issues in Minnesota, in Florida, etc. He's aware of these. His team's aware of these. He knows about probably even more than we know. Why does he look so calm? Like if I was really worried about these things, then I don't think I would look that calm.
Right. If I'd say there are probably a few reasons. First of all, I think the zeitgeist has really changed. I think we're beyond the margin of fraud now. I think you look at the rallies that he's hosting, and you just can't fake things like that. And I think what he went through in Butler, Pennsylvania, I think that was, I can't imagine what that must have been like for him. I mean, what an incredible, we haven't really processed what happened.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that changed him for sure. But then I read something that was interesting the other day too, that, RFK Jr. now is part of the Trump effort. I mean, he's going to be, I don't know what capacity he'll take in the Trump administration if Trump wins, but somebody raised the point that, the Kennedys have been Democrats for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
They know an awful lot of people who are Democrat operatives, and that means that he probably knows some of the dirty tricks that they've employed too in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be that Trump has gotten sort of an inside look through RFK. But then, look, I think there are people who are doing work on his side too to counter some of these efforts behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think that the debates have really revealed that, Harris and Walz are really in bad shape for a lot of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of them is what we talked about before this, which is, if you watch that Walz debate with Vance, or if you listen to what Harris is saying on the campaign trail, it's just promising more free stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's how about $20,000 for a new house? How about we forgive you student loans? How about we give your kids free lunch and free breakfast? There's more and more free stuff. Okay. But voters don't necessarily want the free stuff if there's strings attached to it.
Mhm.
In other words, we care not just about what ends up in our pocket, but we care about how it got there too. And so to the other side, it's like, well, we're offering you all this free stuff. Why don't you vote in your own interest? See, I mean, you must be dumb. I mean, look what we're offering to give you. Why won't you take it? But voters understand, like, I don't want a free lunch.
Mhm.
I just want you to get out of the way, you know? And so you add to that the fact that there's just been a massive erosion of trust in all of our institutions. And the promising free stuff thing just isn't working anymore.
Mhm.
I mean, you can feel it. I mean, you can feel the shift in voting among the minorities. I mean, Trump is peeling off more of the black vote and more of the Hispanic vote
Mhm.
than anybody ever has. So I think the Harris Walz team, and I think a lot of the left is really sensing that there's been a change, that people are beginning to wake up to the fact that we can't rely on government as a paternal figure anymore. It just doesn't work.
Mhm.
That's not what this country's about. So, you know, maybe part of Trump's demeanor comes from that, just understanding that people are tired of it. They don't want to go down that road anymore. You can see where it leads. It's not good. So
How big of a role do you think the two wars play in this election?
yeah,
You know,
huge.
Ukraine and then also, Hamas and Israel.
Mm-hmm. Huge. And frankly, it's a great question, and it's really interesting. So did you see Tulsi Gabbard last night?
No.
Tulsi announced last night at a Trump rally that she is going to join the Party of Peace. She's going to join the Republican Party. So she,
really?
Yep.
Okay.
So she made that official last night. But it was interesting because I think people are also beginning to understand that this doesn't break down along red team versus blue team anymore.
Mhm.
This is more about establishment and elites versus the rest of us versus populism.
Mhm.
And this clash you can take back to Rome, to ancient Rome. You know, you had I won't go down that trail.
Well, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you had so the story goes, all right, this is what I always think of when I think of populists versus sort of the elites. There were these two brothers. There was Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus, I think was his brother's name. And the policy in Rome at the time was, in order to fight for the Roman army, you had to be a landowner. So these landowners in Rome would sign up for the army because it was honor and glory, and you represent your country and everything else. And the Roman army would obviously conquest, far and wide, and destroy and pillage and all the rest of it. Well, when the husbands were away at war, they had their estate at home, and they had their wife and kids at home. Well, the wife and kids couldn't afford to keep up the estate. And so what would happen is they would default, on their bills, and they couldn't pay for it. And the banksters in Rome would come in and scoop up the properties for next to nothing. And then they would work the land. They would put people on the land, and they would start, making money off it, everything else. Well, then these soldiers would come back from war, and they would go, "What'd you do to my house?" You know what I mean? And so, and this happened again and again and again. Well, the first Gracchus brother said, we should probably do something about this, because this isn't right. What you're doing to these families, this isn't helping them out. And so, he spoke out. He ran for office. He was unbelievably popular, and he won election to the Senate. And I think he died under mysterious circumstances. Okay. And then, if I have this right, his brother picked up the mantle on the same idea, ran for office, won election to the Senate. And there was such animosity by the elites against the populists that Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death on the Senate floor. They used legs from tables, and they killed him in the Senate in Rome, because he was a fearless advocate for the people. He was a true populist. So, and that's what I think you're seeing. More and more people are awaking to that now, that, hey, this isn't just red team and blue team. I mean, it's been very effective to divide us against each other, whether it's along those lines, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whatever. As long as we're divided, then we can't be united and fight for the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people are waking up to the fact that it's not a red team, blue team thing anymore. It really is populism versus elites or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, well, hence you see like Tulsi Gabbard, right? So Tulsi Gabbard, Democrat, very much against unnecessary war, right? I'm not going to say she's like a pacifist that says there's never a time for war, but she's looking at this constant flow that we're always getting into wars. There's certain people that make a ton of money when we go to wars, and there's just this cycle, right? And all of a sudden, you're looking and you're saying, well, it used to be like in the 90s, right, where the Democrats would push back against war, right? And that was kind of one of their kind of MOs, right? Well, then they got power after, the Bush kind of regime was done, and we got into more wars. And you just realize, well, it never got any better, right? And then you did have Trump, who is, am I correct? He never got us involved in war? Is
Correct.
He the only one since who knows when?
Right.
Certainly back before the 80s, right?
Right. And that's, again, when it used to be that Congress used to have to declare war, and then we would go to war. But Congress never declared war in Vietnam, and Congress hasn't declared war since. We declared war in Korea, I believe, and certainly World War II, Congress declared war. But since then, Congress has never declared war, yet we're all over the world.
Yeah.
We're dropping bombs everywhere. So, yeah, that's exactly right. And not just Tulsi Gabbard, former Democrat, but RFK Jr., former Democrat. But I think the war thing, what we're doing in Ukraine really has divided the Republican Party. And I think it's kind of divided the Democrat Party too, to some degree. But yeah, you have those who, like you said, those who are loyal to, it's a terrific money-making enterprise. And it's just a horror when you think about it in those terms, but that's what it is. What is it? I forget, there's a quote. It's not coming to me right now, but anyway, right. So I think it did split the party, but now I think it's really unifying. People are understanding we just need to stop. We're not in a position to do this anymore. We're spending money we don't have, hand over fist. The debt situation is totally insane. Yeah, totally insane. By the way, did you see gold?
No. They're breaking new all-time high?
Again.
Yeah.
2750. And it's because the BRICS countries, okay, my theory on it anyway, for what it's worth, the BRICS countries realize that it's going to come down to commodities because you can't print gold. You can't print timber. You can't print oil. So these are things you actually have to have in your hands. They're actually worth something. Whereas numbers on a keyboard and the fact that we've had the world reserve currency for so long, we're at the end. We're at the changing of an era right now, I think.
And Bitcoin?
So, I would put Bitcoin, I would put it right there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's finite, it's scarce, which is more than can be said for dollars.
Yep.
I mean, there's going to be 21 million, and that's it. And so you're seeing slowly kicking and screaming, you're seeing people who opposed it for a long time beginning to get on board. People are understanding that this isn't going anywhere. This is a real thing. And it really, and if you think about Bitcoin a different way, it's redistributing power. I mean, from the elites who control everything to people like us who, we can actually buy it if we want to.
And you can own your own keys.
You can own your own keys. Right. Right. So, yeah, I think it's a fascinating time. But anyway, back to the war question. I think I think that's helped to draw new lines that weren't there before. And I think that the side of peace and reason and diplomacy is winning already. And I do think if Trump wins, I think it's going to be, I mean, he said it'd be done before he takes office. Yeah, well, we'll see about that. But nevertheless, I think he has the respect of world leaders that, I mean, Harris and Walz just don't.
You don't think Walz does?
You know what's interesting though? So this we talked about this earlier today. No, I don't. No. What was so interesting was, did you notice probably, maybe 6 months ago, give or take, when was he picked? Not long after he was picked. Okay. You started hearing for the first time that Republicans were weird. Did you hear that word weird? Have you noticed that?
No.
So the Harris-Walz campaign were calling these guys are just weird, and Walz would say in speeches, they're
I remember
weird.
with Vance. Remember that? Yeah,
Yes.
I remember them calling him. Yeah,
absolutely. So in communist Russia, Pravda, the newspaper, used to accuse their opponent of exactly what they were doing. And it's a really effective tactic because when the other person comes back and says, hey, I'm not weird, you're weird. See what I mean? Then it sounds like, well, I know you are, but what am I? You know what I mean? And it just doesn't go anywhere. Well, it's a tactic that's been deployed for a number of years now, accusing the other side of exactly what you're doing. Hillary is a pro at it. Okay. But that's exactly what Walz began doing after he was picked was this guy's just weird. It's like, no, man, you're the weird guy. It's not him.
Yeah.
But when he says so, or when there's the comeback, it just kind of sounds,
Why do you think they chose him?
Walz?
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Minnesota's not a swing state. He doesn't seem all that skilled. I mean, there's other guys that you're like, I might disagree with you, but you might win a room. Obama could win a room, right? I mean, he was great at that. You can dislike his policies, but he knew how to give a speech. He knew how to rile people up, attractive personality. None of those things apply to Walz.
I know. So my guess is he kind of has that folksy Minnesotan kind of thing. Yeah. It's like, aw shucks, let's just get folks together and get it done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So my guess is that their calculus was that's going to resonate with Midwestern voters. Because more or less everything about Kamala Harris is the antithesis of Midwestern voters. Mm-hmm. So they picked him because he's from Nebraska, so they figure they get the Nebraska vote. And then he's just, now we here know that it's like, aw shucks, it's just aw shucks communism. It's just awesome. He's just an aw shucks commie. Okay. Yeah. But he sounds folksy and friendly, so anyway, that's my guess.
All right. Let's take a quick break.
Yeah.
All right. Bennett says we are back. Talk about RFK. Which we could talk about him some more. Mm-hmm. I'm fascinated by him.
Oh, yeah.
Talk about Tulsi. What about Elon? He's playing a big role in all this, which is just kind of unique. He's just such an interesting thinker. He's a leader in so many ways, and he's just very passionately getting involved in this election. And could even have a role post-election in auditing the government? Is that right?
Right.
So what's going on with Elon?
It's fascinating what's going on with Elon Musk because you notice he has become public enemy number one. Mm-hmm. Did you notice there was just a headline a couple days ago? So Keir Starmer and the Labour Party in the UK are sending all these people to the United States to assist with local elections. And there's this.
Wait, seriously? They're sending people from the UK to help with U.S. elections?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I think today the Trump campaign filed a complaint for election interference against these guys because he has no business here. This is a Labour Party, operatives from the UK who are doing what? I mean, nothing consistent with the Constitution. Anyway, what's been so interesting about it is that he really has become public enemy number one. And one of the stated goals of the CCDH, the Center for Countering Digital Hate, have you heard of these guys? Mm-mm. It's an outfit in the UK whose primary purpose is censorship. They want to take away freedom of speech. They want to restrict online platforms from disseminating messages that they don't agree with. It's that simple. And in this list that they put together, this is just the last day or two here. One of their stated goals is to wipe out Twitter, knock it out, get rid of Elon Musk, silence him. We got to keep him quiet because he's telling too much truth. So, he's fascinating and a very important figure too. But I firmly believe that his purchase of Twitter will go down as one of the most important things that saved this country and preserved the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. Because he's, I don't think anybody can call him a rabid partisan. Nobody can call him a conservative, constitutionalist by any stretch. Okay. Mm-hmm. I mean, you'd probably describe him as left-leaning before all this happened, but he can see what's happening and he understands how important the First Amendment actually is. So yeah, it's been really interesting to see how, what kind of a figure he's become and how he's just been demonized by the left. Mm-hmm. So it's fascinating. There is a case in Minnesota right now, and it just wrapped up in the federal district court, I think last month they got the decision. So the Minnesota legislature passed a law that says you can't talk about being a felon and voting. So you're not allowed to say, if you're a felon and you're not done with your sentence yet, you can't vote.
Which is true, right? Oh, we talked about that before.
Well, yes and no.
Mhm.
Okay. But the law says that if you utter those words, okay, with the intent, okay, or with knowledge that they're untrue, okay, then you're guilty of a crime. And so this case was litigated in federal district court, and Upper Midwest Law Center in James litigated this case. They lost, okay. They're appealing that to the Eighth Circuit, okay. But nevertheless, it all comes back to the same thing, which is it's a restriction on free speech. And they've got to control the message somehow. And that's what I think you're seeing the death of the legacy media and the three-letter agencies and the New York Times and the Star Tribune, okay, whatever. They just don't have, and CNN, they don't have the impact they used to have. Nobody's watching this stuff anymore because people are understanding this is just propaganda. So they're turning to Elon, they're turning to X, or they're turning to Rogan, exactly. How many Substack pages are there? How many people are writing? Just small private blogs, and they're selling, subscriptions. Matt Taibbi selling subscriptions to these services. So, people are reading who they want to read. They're reading who they trust. Seymour Hersh, another example. Okay, the guy who broke that story about what was it? Oh yeah, the Nord Stream pipeline bombing. That's right. Seymour Hersh of My My Massacre fame. Okay, people believe what he says, and so people pay him to read what he has to say. And you can't control that. There's too many of them. So yeah, we're at a fascinating place right now.
How much do you think that's been abused over the past 50 years?
Oh, a lot.
Or maybe beyond that, but
a lot. There's hard evidence that the intelligence community has been putting news anchors into
what was it? You might know the stats on this, but was it like a month or 2 months before the JFK assassination? The CIA appointed something like, goodness, what was it? It was a huge number of people that went and worked at these news stations.
Wow.
And it was right before the assassination took place.
Was that right?
And therefore they were able to control the narrative. And, you speaking of Twitter, I thought about that as I was kind of watching. I wasn't on Twitter. And then the assassination attempt happened on Trump. And I hopped back on Twitter. And I've kind of phased off it just recently. But for a while I was on there because it was such an interesting narrative.
Right.
But I thought about all of the people that were able to post videos. They were able to kind of do all of this analysis and everything. And I was able to access all of that. Right. If you go back to the JFK assassination, like, what could you access?
Right.
45 minutes at 5 o'clock, whatever the media decided to put out.
Yep.
So what we're able to see live, like as it's being discovered on something like Twitter, compared to the type of knowledge they would have in the 60s, it's a completely different way of dissecting and understanding an event that takes place.
It is. Absolutely. And again, it goes back to the erosion of trust in our institutions. We've had these arrangements for such a long time. You're right. I mean, for how long do we believe whatever Walter Cronkite had to say on the nightly news? And our parents, that whole generation, I mean, that's who they trusted for their news. They had no idea, no reason to believe that there were people that were infiltrating, our news sources. So I don't know if you know Mike Benz or not, if that name rings a bell. Mike Benz is he's a former intelligence guy. But he's been in the press quite a bit over the last several months talking about, hey, this is what our intelligence community is doing. And like it or not, agree with it or disagree with it, here's what's really going on. And it's been really illuminating. It's an open secret. It's not, controversial at all.
What kind of things?
That our narrative has been shaped by what our intelligence community wants us to think. We all have this conceived. I mean, the most immediate example is what we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is Ukraine. Okay, we've been led to believe that Putin is this bloodthirsty monster who's just out to destroy the world just
Mhm.
because he's nuts and because he's a bad guy. Well, that's not consistent with his conduct or Russia's conduct or Ukraine's conduct for that matter.
Mhm.
It doesn't even make any sense. We were told a couple of years ago that Putin bombed his own pipeline. We were told that Vladimir Putin bombed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It's like, well, wait a minute. So Russia was going to supply cheap gas to Germany and the rest of Europe. So Germany would benefit because it could, industrialize further and advance, and Russia would benefit because it's got all kinds of resources and just not enough people. So they're going to make money. Germany's going to make money. Everybody's going to win. Well, we couldn't have that
Mhm.
because that means they're not buying gas from us.
Mhm.
And so Putin bombed his own pipeline. It doesn't make any sense at all. Yet that's the narrative that we were given. That doesn't happen by accident.
And what was the real story there?
Well, the real story was, at least the story that Seymour Hersh broke,
Mhm.
okay, is that there were divers, and these divers were they trained in this deep water facility somewhere in Florida, and members of our intelligence community approached them and said, "Hey, here's what we want to do." And the long and short of it is, we hold military operations in that part of the world with, I think it's Norway and some other Scandinavian countries. And so we were having these military exercises during that time. And somebody a diver snuck down to the pipeline, planted a device. They picked a part of the ocean that was not, reasonably shallow off the
Mhm.
coast of Norway somewhere, and had these divers go down and plant this device. And it had a signal. It had some sort of a transmitter where once it received 3 tones, that would trigger the detonation device and it would blow it up. Well, they dove down, they planted the device, and then disappeared and cleared out, and then waited for a number of months after that until the timing was right, and then set it off.
Mhm.
That's the story that Seymour Hersh published. So, believe it, don't believe it, but a lot of truth there.
Mhm.
Sure seems like it. So that's the real story. Now you're hearing that, well, it was actually a group of Ukrainians or Ukrainian mercenaries who did it, or some version of that, but I don't know how much that's true.
Mhm.
What I don't believe is true is that Vladimir Putin bombed the
Sabotaged
Nord Stream
himself,
pipeline.
yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense at all.
Mhm.
So,
Where do you think that war is going?
I think it's going nowhere fast.
Mhm.
I mean, frankly, if I had to guess, I would say that Zelensky will either be dead or completely excommunicated in 6 months.
Really?
Yeah.
And it would be Russia that gets him, or it would be his own people?
Or our people.
Really?
I don't see it going anywhere. I mean, this is not sustainable.
Mhm.
It never has been. There's nothing in it for us at all. I think Ukraine, by and large, is being proven to be just a money siphoning operation.
Mhm.
I think we're pumping as many billions as we can because you've heard people like Lindsey Graham talk about this. It's coming back to benefit our own defense contractors, and therefore the United States is actually benefiting from it. We're making money because people work at those factories and they're
Mhm.
employing people, and it's really just a depraved way of thinking about the world.
Mhm.
We're funding the death of an entire generation, 500,000 Ukrainian young men.
Mhm.
And what do we get? Well, we get more jobs. I mean, wow, what a lesson, what a message that is for people. I mean, what do you tell your kids?
Mhm.
Why are we fighting in Ukraine? And by the way, we're fighting in Ukraine. It's a proxy war. Okay.
Mhm.
Ukraine never had any chance against Russia in any capacity. This was never close. It was never, well, if we just give one final push, they'll have enough. No.
And that narrative that held steam for a while.
Did.
We'd hear early on, it'd be like, well, here was, Russia's not doing as good as it can. Like, oh, they're really running out. Their supply chains are broken down like that. And yeah.
The ghost fighter, remember the ghost fighter of Ukraine?
No, what was that?
This mysterious fighter jet pilot who would, bomb people in the middle of the night in Russia. They'd never know who the guy was because he's just too good, whatever.
Yeah.
All that stuff is, So
Have you followed Candace Owens at all on this?
a little bit.
Yeah.
Not on Russia,
Okay.
but I have.
Well, I'm not going to even bring it up then. Someone was telling me about this. someone I respect. So I haven't followed the story myself, so I don't want to secondhand talk about what she's talking about
Yeah.
and be completely wrong. But
Yeah.
yeah, she's got an interesting take on this that has to do with Christianity.
Oh,
So,
really?
yeah, worth looking into. I haven't looked into it yet, but worth looking into.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Now that you mention it, I've heard a couple of things. I think
Okay.
I might have heard her take on it a little
Mhm.
bit. Just that there have been an awful lot of deaths of Christians in that part of the world, and we don't really hear too much about that.
Yeah.
Like the gulags in the Soviet Union were a heck of a lot of Christians were in those prisons and suffering
Mhm.
under those conditions. And yeah, we're not told about that too much.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting. It's if you know about the Maidan coup, if you know about what happened in 2014, yeah,
Can you explain that?
yeah, that's I mean that's the way. If you understand that, that's probably, in my opinion, that's the best place to start for me anyway. It was to
Mhm.
understand what's going on with the rest of it. But yeah, in 2014, Ukraine elected a guy who was loyal to Russia, and we didn't like that too much.
Mhm.
And so the election might have been in 2013. I could be wrong. But anyway, what happened was our CIA or our State Department funded basically a group of rebels in Ukraine.
Insurrectionists, right?
Insurrectionists. That's right. That's right. So we funded these guys. And long story short, we wound up overthrowing the government in Ukraine and installing a guy who was loyal to the United States versus being loyal to Russia.
And we had senators, if I remember right, that on the news, right, on our own American news, talked about how we succeeded in this, and we're boasting about that.
Right. One of those senators happened to be our own Amy Klobuchar, as a matter of fact. Anyway, so after that took place, okay, Putin understood at that point, okay, I see what's going on, okay. And the example I always draw is, well, if China, okay, went to Toronto and said, we're running out of space for missiles and we're just going to keep a couple of missiles up here in Toronto. We're not going to use them against you or anything. We just want a place to keep them, no big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Would we be okay with that? And of course the answer is no, it's absurd. Well,
yeah, if they were, I mean, just even add more context, if they were bragging in 2020 that they overthrew, I mean, Trudeau's probably more their guy than anyone else you could think of. But let's imagine that Trudeau was just, a stand-up guy or whatever. Let's imagine that Trudeau was very pro-US.
Right.
And then let's imagine that there's a coup and he gets overthrown. And then this big pro-China guy comes in. And then China is boasting about how the fact that they helped put that guy in.
Right.
Right. Their elected officials are bragging about that. And we're sitting here watching this and going, huh.
Right.
And then a couple years later, then China, with the help of their newly appointed prime minister, says, hey, we're going to bring missiles and weapons of mass destruction and put it in. How would the U.S. respond?
Exactly. Well, we know how they'd respond because we had the Bay of Pigs. And speaking of Kennedy, we had the Bay of Pigs in 1963 where, Russia said, yeah, we're just going to store some nukes on Cuba. We're not going to use them against you or anything. We're just going to keep them there just because it's a place to put them. We're low on space. And what do we do? Well, we sent gunboats out to say, no, I mean, that was probably the closest we've been to nuclear annihilation till now.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you saw Kennedy say, no, that doesn't work. And we sent out gunboats to say, nope, turn the Russian ships around. It's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we would do. And so that's not what Russia did. They were patient, but they've watched while we have occupied Ukraine by and large. We've, they passed a law in Ukraine. And when I say passed a law, okay, it's not a democracy. Okay. So anybody who says we need to protect democracy, that's our job. Red flags. Be cautious of that person. It's not their job or anybody else's job to protect democracy. Okay. Anyway, what's going on in Ukraine has nothing to do with democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, they passed a law or some sort of executive order that allowed foreign corporations, to own private property in the Ukraine. And so the conspiracy theory, if you want to call it that, or the truth theory, okay, is that when all this is said and done, when all this terrible conflict that never should have happened is over, then corporations like BlackRock are going to come in and they're going to buy the real estate closer to cities. Companies like Dow or ConAgra are going to come in and buy the farmland.
Mhm.
You know, Ukraine once upon a time was known as the breadbasket of Europe because the soil is so rich. Well, somebody's got to own the land to produce the crops to sell to the rest of Europe. Yeah, so that's one way that Ukraine's new law could be abused, and some people like Tucker Carlson, for example, thinks that's the direction it's headed.
Again,
So-
it's the elite versus the people, right? And that seems to be the new lines that are in the sand.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think you're going to see that play out again and again, not just in the country, but in Minnesota too. So
do you think there's a way that in the next let's imagine Trump's elected, right? So he's at least claimed he can put an end to this war. Is that right? Do you see that playing out? And if so, how does that happen?
I do, absolutely. There are a lot of allies. I mean, here's the thing. It's time to accept that this is no longer a unipolar world. You can see it. There was just a summit of the BRICS countries just a couple of days ago, 2 or 3 days ago.
BRICS countries, can you name some of those again?
Yeah, BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Okay, but now you can add to that. You can add Saudi Arabia, which is not so good for us. You can add Saudi Arabia to that list. You can add Iran to that list. You can add most of the Middle East, frankly. But the point is that alliance is growing and our alliance is not growing. So the bottom line is you have to accept that there's going to be a unipolar world. So yeah, I do believe that Trump would be able to end it. And how? Well, he already has allies in the region. He has Hungary, Viktor Orban in Hungary. He has Meloni in Italy. She's certainly receptive.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of officials. There's the guy from Serbia, I think. Anyway, the way to do it is to just be done. Be done. We're no longer funding this. We don't want anything to do with it. We're pulling out of Ukraine. We're going to make it a neutral country. The tragedy, speaking of Elon, the tragedy is that, 2 years ago when all this began, Elon said, tell you what, he did the poll on X. He said, who believes that if we promise that Ukraine will never become a NATO country, we promise it'll never become militarized, we withdraw, Russia stays out of it, and it's a neutral country, who wants that? Who supports that? Overwhelmingly, because he said that's where it's going to end up anyway. And that's where we are. So that is where I think it's going to end up. We're going to pull out. We're going to defund. Ukraine's going to be its own country. It's going to rebuild. God bless them. I have no idea how they're going to do it. I mean, talk about picking up the pieces of a total tragedy. But yeah, we can do it. I think we will. There's certainly willpower. I mean, there's enough people here who support it. So, yeah.
Well, we got a couple minutes left, and then I know you got to go pick your kids up. What's some kind of final thoughts from Greg Joseph?
Well, let me give this quick update for anybody who's still wondering about it. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about Scott Jensen's case, where that is.
Previous candidate for governor, Republican candidate.
Correct. Correct. Yep. So we obviously sued the Board of Medical Practice because of what they did to him during the campaign, for years. And we originally litigated the case in federal district court in Minnesota and lost. We were dismissed for lack of standing. Then we drafted and filed an amended complaint. I argued that in August, toward the end of August, and currently we're waiting on the judge to make up his mind. We have excellent arguments. They're on very solid ground. They're really clear First Amendment violations. And I hope for the best, but we will get justice one way or the other for them. So, yeah.
All right. Well, Greg, thank you for your time again.
Thanks, Brian.
And we'll have you on again in the spring. We'll see where we're at.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Cheers.